Well, they bragged about using facial recognition to have those people arrested by law enforcement.
Yeah, right.
And that's what people don't realize, is that this is really an outgrowth of the war on domestic terror. There were explicit efforts said by Bill Gates, but also maybe tech billionaires you don't hate, about combining national security with health security.
In this video, Whitney Webb discusses the growing fusion of national security and health security, particularly through the involvement of companies like Palantir in government surveillance initiatives. The conversation highlights how AI and facial recognition are increasingly being used for law enforcement, drawing parallels to the post-9/11 era and the war on domestic terror. The speakers argue that major tech figures, including Bill Gates, have promoted the blending of these two sectors, with the goal of using predictive analytics and biosurveillance to control public health crises. This trend was evident during COVID-19, where AI-driven tools were used to preemptively predict outbreaks, despite their questionable accuracy, as seen in the case of diagnostic robotics in Rhode Island. The discussion warns that these technologies, which often lack transparency and effectiveness, are being used to justify the restriction of civil liberties.
And that is why Palantir is running it for the national security state, and they're also running it for HHS. The goal is to fuse those two things into one thing, and the way they'll probably do it, or the easiest way for them to manufacture consent for that, is what they tried to do with the 2001 anthrax attacks and talk about bioterror. And, you know, there was sort of efforts to seed these kind of narratives in early COVID-19. Neo-Nazis are licking doorknobs and giving people COVID. That was literally like stories that happened. Those were real stories, used to sort of fearmonger this type of stuff. And I think, you know, they may try and, you know, they're not a creative bunch. They like to recycle a lot of their narratives and their old playbooks. Look no further than the Sean Ryan show for proof of that. But I think people should be very cognizant of this stuff, because it's going to be framed as a win. They will say, oh, we only have to lock down this community and that community and not the whole country. And people that criticize the COVID response, I'm sure many of them will applaud it. But the problem is, this was actually tested out during COVID-19 itself, basically the Israeli equivalent of Palantir as it relates to COVID-19 response. And I say that in the context of Palantir's contract with Operation Warp Speed. But the Israeli equivalent of that in the COVID-19 era was this firm called Diagnostic Robotics. And they were given a contract to basically predict COVID outbreaks in Rhode Island before they happened by then Governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, who later became Biden's Commerce Secretary. And this firm, if you believe their own numbers that they put out in like their PR leaflets and stuff, say that their algorithm is 75% accurate, and that's not audited. So we could assume that it's probably lower than what they publicly profess in their sales pitch. So maybe it's 60%, maybe it's 50%. I don't know. But that's getting dangerously close, or in the case of 50%, literally is the same as a coin toss. Right. So you're deciding to either shut down entire local economies based on an algorithm that is not 100% accurate. So I would argue that isn't better. You're still taking away people's civil liberties based on faulty data. And if it's about, you know, using AI algorithms that aren't accurate either and notoriously racially biased, to be like, this ethnic minority needs the shot and this one doesn't, which is exactly what Palantir did under Operation Warp Speed. That's what their Tiberius program literally was about. You know, it definitely becomes very Orwellian. And so maybe it's not collective punishment, maybe in the same way as during the COVID-19 era.
The conversation then delves into the historical roots of these programs, linking them to earlier total information awareness initiatives that sought to collect and analyze vast amounts of data under the guise of public safety. Palantir is described as a privatized extension of these defunded government programs, with direct ties to figures like Peter Thiel and former intelligence officials. The speakers emphasize that AI-driven decision-making, particularly in healthcare and pandemic responses, can lead to unethical outcomes, including racially biased policies and the suppression of individual rights. They also argue that these systems do not need to be highly accurate to be effective in controlling public behavior, as the mere perception of surveillance can induce compliance, a concept rooted in the panopticon theory.
But this is ultimately this idea of sort of personalizing things, whether it's personalized COVID vaccines or personalized, localized pandemic response. This was the goal. And a lot of this stuff, as I noted during the COVID era, the antecedents of it were all sort of dreamt up and first attempted, in the immediate post 9/11 era. I don't know. It seems like a lot of those programs have not gone away. And actually, a lot of the total information awareness programs, they were specifically called biosurveillance. And some of them included, surveilling wastewater to prevent disease before it happens. And that was literally a program that was launched during COVID and that Palantir runs. And I've argued in my work that Palantir is just the privatized version of total information awareness, because Peter Thiel and Alex Karp went to the guy running total information awareness and were basically like, tell us what to do because we want to make this a private company now that you're being defunded by Congress. And then get all this money from the CIA and the top people at the CIA that were working on total information awareness with the DARPA people and John Poindexter become the main funders of Palantir with Peter Thiel. I mean, I don't know. But I should say, in the context of the PayPal presidency theme, that Palantir itself started off as the anti-fraud algorithm at PayPal, and PayPal itself as a company started as a consequence of its founders having extensive conversations with every three-letter agency that would talk to them. That's according to PayPal co-founder Max Levchin. So, who gave a spirited defense of NSA warrantless spying in the Snowden era. So much for that whole libertarian veneer of the PayPal crowd.
Finally, the discussion critiques the influence of big tech and its deep entanglement with government power, questioning the motivations behind the rapid expansion of AI surveillance. The speakers highlight how law enforcement and public health agencies continue to deploy flawed AI models, despite known biases and inaccuracies, suggesting that their primary purpose is not public safety but population control. Concerns are raised about figures like Alex Karp, CEO of Palantir, whose personal views on race and security are seen as problematic given the power his company wields over surveillance and health data. The conversation concludes with a strong warning about the potential for these technologies to be used in a way that mirrors past eugenics policies, shaping access to medical treatments and public health interventions based on AI-driven profiling rather than genuine medical necessity.
But they don't need to be accurate. I mean, it's an industry with a lot of overhype issues. And a lot of these companies that are the biggest AI companies, especially when it's like legacy big tech companies making them, like Google or Oracle or whatever, a lot of them have very deep national security connections from their origins on and are arguably fronts for those agencies. At which point you have to, they only really need the perception that the algorithm is accurate anyway. And I don't think, a lot of what you brought up earlier about like Ellison saying AI surveillance systems will have people be on their best behavior. The whole idea of the panopticon and all of that is the idea that, you're being watched constantly, but you don't know if you're being watched. So that induces obedience and quote unquote correct behavior. And so, they could, the idea that the algorithm is monitoring these things, even if it's not accurate, it can still, have a lot of the same consequences as long as people think it's accurate. And I think there's a lot of perception manipulation. I think that's pretty clear for the public. And a lot of it is trying to manage how the public feels about it. And having these sort of AI surveillance systems is meant to sort of have that kind of panopticon effect. I don't think they're really in these applications really meant to work very much, As an example, like law enforcement use of AI, in Britain, the Met Police had a contract with I forget what company, but it was found to be notoriously inaccurate. They were using it for live facial recognitions of all sorts of public events in the UK. And it came out that it was like its accuracy was just dismal. And they made no effort to correct or change vendors. Why would that be? Because they don't care. Yeah. Right? I mean, because if they did care, they would obviously change vendors. There's no shortage of people selling that particular product. But the idea is that they're being watched, but it's important to point out too that they're also very racially biased. which has I argued in my work in the COVID era there was a lot of eugenics era people that have rebranded. Bill Gates became kind of infamous as a figure pushing policies analogous to that, and I think people should be pretty wary of that, especially when Palantir's evolved because of its history of racial bias and things like pre-crime, which they call predictive policing, and also in warp speed, and also people like Peter Thiel and Alex Karp's like complete obsession with race stuff. Like Alex Karp is like convinced that like white Americans are going to push him out of a high-rise building because he's half black and half Jewish. And he's like, I'm amazed I haven't been murdered by a different race yet. I don't think that sounds like a sane person that I want having this much power over our surveillance state and healthcare data. And that's going to have the power to segment populations and decide what quote unquote medical interventions they're prescribed by the state in some sort of national level health event or whatever. It's bonkers.